So good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight, braving the terrible Georgia weather out there with the, I believe those are water droplets that are coming from the sky that hit the pavement and cause all sorts of harm to Georgians everywhere. So I appreciate you coming out tonight and joining us. We have a really interesting group of panelists here to talk about school choice. This is something that is increasingly a topic of great interest and a controversial topic in Georgia. And we're going to try to talk tonight a little bit about historically how choice has been thought of both in Georgia as well as nationally, and to give you a sense of some of the changes that are going on in Georgia and what we know about some of those changes and how they might impact schools, school choice, academic achievement, and learning in Georgia. I want to be really clear to start off, and I think I met virtually everyone here, but I'll introduce myself. I'm Chris Morphew. I'm Dean of the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, and I'll introduce the other panelists here in a second. I want to be really clear when we start off. We're not talking about choice tonight from an ideological perspective. We will not attempt to educate you comprehensively about everything there is to know about school choice and charters and pluralism in K-12 and higher education tonight, but we do have some very interesting perspectives on the subject. And at the end of the day, I think far too often when you hear about school choice and the debates around school choice in the United States, they are polarizing. And the reality of school choice is much more complex, much more nuanced, much more interesting. And it has different flavors to it and different contexts to it, and we're going to try to talk about some of those tonight. So it's my job to do a little scene setting and introduce our panelists, and I'm going to do that right away. I've got some notes here. We have 4 panelists with us tonight that represent very different backgrounds and perspectives and come at the topic of school choice from both professional as well as personal experiences. To my right is Josh Thomason. Josh is the VP at the Greater Atlanta Christian School, and Josh, in addition to being an MBA and accountant, is a 2019 EDD graduate from Johns Hopkins School of Education, so it's great to have an alum here. And Josh is, as I said, a VP and the head of finance at Greater Atlanta Christian School, but is also the director of the online school there at GAC, which he might tell you a little about in his remarks. To Josh's right, we have Dr. Angela Watson. Dr. Watson is an assistant research professor at the School of Education at Johns Hopkins, where she works in the Institute for Ed Policy. And Angela is a scholar on a broad set of issues on school reform and school choice, and she's going to help us understand school choice from a empirical and national data perspective tonight. To Angela's right is Kimani Freeman. Kimani is currently a master's student at the School of Education in Ed Policy, and has had was telling me about some great experiences in the Ed Policy course. Dr. Plucker was making you going to some meetings, some very controversial meetings around school choice. You saw just what a heated topic this could be. Kimani is currently a learning specialist and special education teacher at KIPP Metro in Atlanta here, and as I said, currently a master's student at the School of Education. And finally, Dr. Tonia Garden, to Kimani's right, is a clinical... Durden. What did I say? Darden? Garden. I said Darden. I'm sorry. Tonia Durden. It's right here in front of me. Tonia Durden, who is a clinical professor, thank you, at Georgia State University, and a former Nebraskan for a short period of time, she was telling me about. And she is the director of the early childhood program, and she's a professor in the early childhood and elementary education program at Georgia State, where she received, I believe, all 3 of her degrees, if I remember her, 2 of her degrees from Georgia State here in Atlanta. So this is a great panel, and we're going to start off talking a little bit about the roots of school choice in Atlanta and in Georgia. And those of you who are in the audience, I'm sure, are aware of some of the current bills that have been proposed and passed in some cases around choice, and not passed very recently as well in Georgia around school choice and expanding notions of school choice in Atlanta. But I asked Josh to talk a little bit about framing the history of school choice in Atlanta and in Georgia from the perspective of a leader at a independent school here in Greater Atlanta. So, Josh, you want to kick things off?
Yeah, thanks, Dean, and thanks for having me here tonight. It really is an honor to be here. So I'm going to preface this by saying, as you said, I'm an accountant and a CPA, and by no stretch would I ever pretend to be an expert educator. They probably don't want to hear me say that with an EDD from Hopkins. But so when it relates to the history of independent schools in Georgia, I'm not a historian by any stretch, but I've been around and I've heard stories and I've read a good bit, so I'll just share a little bit of what I know. As you go back, history of independent schools in Atlanta really dates back over, in Georgia really dates back over 100 years. One of the very first created was what was at the time known as Georgia Military Academy, which is now Woodward Academy. Woodward is probably the third or fourth largest independent school in the country. I think 2,400 students is where they are today. And I think in the 60s is when they became co-ed, and that's when they converted from Georgia Military to Woodward Academy. Connected to that, 1901 was the Marist School. So the Marist School is a Catholic school up in Dunwoody that launched in 1901. And so, from that point up until about the 60s, the 50s and 60s, you had a handful of schools that were launched. I think Lovett launched as an Episcopal school in 1926. But really the next real big growth of independent schools in Georgia was 50s, 60s, and 70s. So Westminster, which is certainly has the largest endowment in the city, launched in the early 50s. I believe Pace launched in 1958. And so you had a handful of schools launched then. And then in the 60s and 70s is when you really saw the suburban Christian schools emerge. And if you know anything about the South in the 1960s and 70s, you know that was when integration in public schools was happening, and you had many of these Christian schools that were emerging in response to integration. And so they really were emerging as segregationist academies. And so many of the Christian schools that that emerged in that time frame came from that perspective. I'll reference GAC's history on that here in a second. And then in the 2008 is when you had the next kind of round of change in independent schools, and that is when the state tax credit came into be. I forget the exact title. Angela may recall the exact title of the tax credit. Most people, the biggest is Georgia Goal, and that Georgia Goal is where you're able to defer your taxes and those to an independent school, and those independent schools then give that money away in the form of financial aid. So that was the next big area of growth. In independent schools in general, particularly in Georgia, from around 2000 up until about 2018 were in decline. If you paid close attention to places like Westminster, they were in decline in their lower schools while they were 4 deep in the waiting list in high school, so they just grew their high school to keep their enrollment flat. Woodward, I think, dropped 400 or 500 students over that 20-year period. GAC was not immune to that. So just a little bit of background on GAC. GAC was launched in 1968 in Norcross. So Norcross is up the 85 corridor just outside 285. I will not pretend for 1 second to say we always did things perfectly. But when we launched in 1968, we were integrated from day one. So even though many wanted us to be a segregated school, we were an integrated school from day one. Our board was integrated by year 2. To date, we are a majority students of color school. Over half of our students attend on some form of financial aid. Right now we're about 1,800 students K-12, about a $70-80 million endowment, 29 APs, AP pass rate of 80+%. We send students to the Ivies, we send students to the best art schools, and we send students to top flight athletics in Division I. Across the gamut, we're able to meet your needs academically, athletic, artistically, and spiritually. We're a Christian school, so we're also able to do that. As Dean referenced, in 2018, so before COVID, we launched what we call Ethos, which is our online school. And we launched it in a way that other independent schools, particularly small independent schools, could have access to high quality online classes that they weren't able to achieve otherwise. And so we started that with 5 partner schools and 36 students. Today we're a little over 60 partner schools across the globe between Africa, East Asia, Europe, and the US. with a little over 600 students. And so that platform has grown. Like I said, we launched it before COVID, and that was actually spawned from my dissertation study at Hopkins. And so, yeah, that's just a very brief introduction to the history of independent schooling in Georgia as I understand it, and a little bit of background on GAC. So thank you.
Thanks, Josh. Angela, in your, as I mentioned when I introduced you earlier, you're a scholar of, among other things, reform and school choice. I think with the recent passage of some bills, and again, others that haven't passed in Georgia, I think it's a reasonable question for Georgians to ask, how does Georgia look in comparison to other states on issues of school choice? Could you help us with that?
Sure. So thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here with you tonight. So I think it's important when we're talking about school choice, when you mention that, people take up their corners, whatever it is that they think about school choice, they get in their corner and people get emotional about it, which is fine, but I think it's important to kind of frame our discussion in like the facts of where we are in school choice in Atlanta and in Georgia and kind of how that looks. And so I took a look at the stats of the various types of schooling in Atlanta, in Georgia, and then compared that to the national averages for those, and then also looking at neighboring states. And so looking at Georgia, in Georgia right now, 1%, as much as we argue over publicly funded private school choice, which is vouchers and ESAs and tax credits, currently 1% of students use those in Georgia, and that is at the national average. 1 to 2% of students use public monies to fund private education in some form or other. I call it a vehicle, right? So this is a super, super small number of students that we argue a lot over. Of course, Florida, we have some folks here from Florida. Florida is kind of the Wild West of school choice, and they're several years ahead. And so we can kind of look at what's going on in Florida and think that maybe that's what things could look like in other states. And even in Florida, they have such a long history and such a robust school choice market and such a long history. Even there, only 4 to 4.5% of all K-12 age students are using a publicly funded mechanism for private school choice. So still a really small number of students. So I study in particular homeschooling. And so to put this in context, pre-COVID, homeschool students accounted for about 2.7% of all American K-12 age students. Post-COVID, it's about 5.5%. So there are significantly more students in America that are homeschooled that are compared to using these publicly funded private school mechanisms for schooling. So in Georgia specifically, 1% use these public monies, vouchers, and ESAs, and we can talk more about the ESA bill that was turned down this session, but it is coming back, and you're getting a universal ESA here pretty soon. So we can talk about that. But tax credit.
Can you remind them what an ESA is?
I'm sorry, educational savings account. Well, you call it the what was it called? The Georgia Promise Scholarship, but it's an educational savings account.
And other people might refer to these as vouchers?
It's similar to a voucher. It is not a voucher. It is different than a voucher. But yes, it's public monies that will be used to pay for private education. So we can talk more about that bill. But in general, it looks like the public funding for private education is about the same as the national average. Florida, like I said, 4.5%. Looking in Alabama, they do have an ESA, but it's only for students that are low income, and it serves less than 3,000 kids in Alabama. So compared to states around you, you're very similar or have more kids being served, but still super small amounts with these public funding mechanisms. Charter school participation was really interesting, and that was one of the main topics that we were going to talk about tonight. Charter school participation nationally is about 7%. In all of Georgia, you only have 3% of students participating in charter schools. Now in Atlanta, it's higher. I think it's 18% in charter schools. Yes. of all of your K-12 population. So there are more people in charter schools in Atlanta, but overall, you have fewer children in charter schools than the national average. And then South Carolina, I also looked, they have very little school choice. 7% of kids are in charters in South Carolina, and they only have public funding for children with special needs to attend private schools. Those are the only kids that are allowed to do that. And then homeschooling, like I said, 5% in Georgia. So the national average is 5.4% right now. 5% of your students in Georgia attend homeschooling. I don't know specifically about Atlanta because I don't have those data, but they do exist. Atlanta, or the DOE does have homeschool participation broken out by district or by county, and so you can look at that. Let's see, and then the charter schools, I thought this was interesting too. So Georgia has 93 charter schools as of their last report that I gathered this information from. They serve about 60,000 students, 3% of the total population in Georgia of kids, but 19 of those schools serve Atlanta particularly. And so I thought that was interesting, that there are quite a few charter schools in other areas. They're not all focused to the Atlanta area. Now, some of the other charter schools do serve statewide, and so it's possible that Atlanta kids are in other charters than just those 19. But it does kind of give you an idea of just exactly what the landscape looks like when we're talking about these various types of school choice. And then private schools, Georgia, 800 private schools serve approximately 8% of all students in Georgia, and that also is right on the national average. Pre-COVID, it was like 10 to 12% of students were attending a private school. Currently, the NCS estimates 7.6% of students nationwide attend a private school. So you're right on there. And then private schools in Atlanta specifically, there are 143 schools. They serve 17% of all students, so about what you have in charter schools. So I think it's interesting to look at, the actual context on the ground about what we're talking about.
And it is really interesting. We're going to come back to this in a second, Angela. Prepare you for this question. Why, given the numbers that are so small when it comes to public funds going for non-traditional public purposes, right, why is the debate so loud and so polarizing? So we'll come back to you and ask you about that. Sure. But in terms of, you mentioned charter schools in Atlanta. Kimani Freeman is a learning specialist and special education teacher at KIPP, which is a network of charter schools nationally, and they have probably several locations in Atlanta, right? And Kimani, it would be helpful for folks to hear a little bit, I think. Angela mentioned when people say choice, all sorts of things fly into their heads, right? Public money going to Christian schools, homeschooling, all sorts of things. But a big share of what choice is, particularly in urban educational systems, are charter schools. So could you talk a little bit about what it's like to teach in a charter school in Atlanta, how the questions around choice influence who your students are, the kinds of learning experiences you're able to offer them?
Yeah, definitely. First and foremost, thank you for having me. I feel very privileged to be up here with all of you. So just to kind of preface what I'm going to say, I started my teaching career in Springfield, Massachusetts as a dual language special education teacher in a public school, and now I'm in a charter school. So you kind of understand where, all of my data and, my sentiments are kind of coming from. So when we're thinking kind of about charter schools for teachers, the first thing that comes to mind is kind of pay. As a teacher, that's the first thing you're kind of looking at. Pay is definitely slightly better for charter school teachers. That rings true all over the country. Given whatever their budget looks like, they're able to pay you slightly better. In Atlanta, it's known that KIPP is better, they're able to pay their teachers better than, let's say, APS or Clayton County or Cobb County, or they pay equivalent to Cobb County, which is one of the better paying districts. In terms of unions, there's a lack of unions when it comes to charter schools. I was part of a union at my first placement school in Springfield, so there are things that kind of go unheard or unseen in charter schools that if you are in a public school, you can have, your union would have your back and you could just go ahead and ask for representation, and that's something that just doesn't happen in charter schools. So in terms of funding, because this semester for my master's, that is everything that I've been looking at, there's less funding for charter schools. So in terms of my experience, everybody keeps talking about, oh, we don't have the money, we don't have the money, we don't have the money. And that actually kind of rings true. A paper that I actually just cited last night in my last paper says that charter schools receive, on average, 27% less than their traditional public schools. So that's about $5,828 less than traditional public schools. And that gap has grown 58% wider since 2013. So just take a minute and sit in that. And that can go both ways. You can either be angered by that, you can be kind of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And it kind of just depends on how you look at school choice, kind of how we were talking about that before. In terms of Atlanta, other big cities such as Newark, where I'm from, and Boston and Houston, that gap has actually decreased. Atlanta has gotten bigger. So for this study, Atlanta actually got an F. Yeah. So the district got 18 district schools receive per pupil. So their district, state funding, they get $18,276 per student for traditional public schools. For charter school students, they get $9,382. So that's a negative 49%, and that is greater than the national average. Yeah. A pro of teaching in a charter school is you have a unique curriculum. In KIPP, Metro Atlanta, we focus on our 7 core values, which are linked to Kwanzaa, since we teach predominantly African American students, so Umoja, Kujajakulia, Kimani, Nia, the whole 9. So that's really fun, but at the same time, when it comes to Georgia milestones, sometimes you focus so much on your unique curriculum that your students are unable to perform on testing. And I know we're not supposed to teach to the test, but you are sometimes unable to prepare your students accurately. And finally, teacher credentials. It really depends on the state, and it depends on the school. Some charter schools don't require you to have proper credentials, and some do. KIPP actually does, but some charter schools will just let you come in with just a bachelor's or just an associate's or just your high school.
So thanks, Kimani. In addition to the debate around school choice that has been swirling around Georgia and other states over the last several years, there's a simultaneous debate. I think that it challenges some and makes some of these issues around school choice even more polarizing. Tonia Durden, as I introduced her before, is a professor at Georgia State University, specializing in early childhood and elementary education. And Tonia, if you could talk a little bit, different topic than the rest of what we've heard today. And thinking about early childhood and some of the other legislation that has been proposed in Georgia and passed in Georgia and some other states around cultural topics. Could you talk a little bit about some trends that you've observed in the social emotional development of early childhood grades when it comes to independent charter schools versus district and public schools? And then in the context of that, talk a little bit about where do you think what is going to be the impact of legislation that has been passed in Georgia and other states about what can be taught in terms of culturally responsive topics around everything from CRT to DEI issues.
You said I had 2 hours, right? I got 2 hours. Well, first, thanks, Dean, as well as the college for this panel and this community dialogue, and also Ms. Ingram for your direct invitation. I also want to recognize Elder Patsy Jo Hilliard, who is in the house. She is actually a superstar. For those of us who are in Atlanta, who know her work, her community engagement, also international scholar of Dr. Asa Hilliard, and it's so interesting that as I was writing notes, his name and his work was one of the first things that I was going to talk about, so a shade of that, right? So to start off, I'm going to tell a little story. So I am from Atlanta, Decatur, where's greater to be exact. So not only do I study about equity and education, and I'll talk a little bit about school choice, because for many Black and brown children, particularly in Atlanta, there is no choice, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So I was a part of an educational system that from my early years centered me as a Black child. My language, all of my teachers were African American. I was, in the community, et cetera, et cetera. And so when we think about school choice. So when we think about these trends, so I'm going to start way back, because one of my panelists here talked about kind of this historical context. So when we think about even during slavery times, there were Black independent schools, right? Because that was the only way. It was first illegal for African Americans to be educated. And so post-slavery, those Black independent schools continued forward. All right, and so these were thriving Black independent schools. And then much of our, particularly here within the Atlanta area, we have many HBCUs that carried on the education, because you could not earn a bachelor's degree in many of our education schools across the country. So that became a place in which our Morehouse and Spelman and Clark and Morris Brown and Fort Valley provided professional degrees in education. And so many of our schooling, our educational schooling, both early childhood, elementary, and so forth, were conducted in Black independent schools. Here comes integration. So with integration, prior to integration, many of our elementary and secondary school were staffed by professional, particularly Black women, in our Georgia schools. After integration, it went from 100%, of Black teachers to less than 20% of Black teachers now within our school systems, and that trend continues. Currently in our classrooms from early childhood through secondary, 84% of the K-12 teacher population are white women. And so you can do the math, right? And that's a direct result of integration. And so a part of the work that I do is looking at ways in which educational systems center the voices and experiences of Black children. So less on school choice and more on what are the opportunities for children to thrive, to focus on cultural and academic excellence, and also to have safe, nonviolent, joyful experiences in the classroom. What does that look like, particularly for Black, Latin, and Indigenous children? And so as we venture to the early 90s, so I am a graduate of Columbia High School in Decatur, Georgia. And what was really interesting is that my mother was and again, all Black community, right? So there was this new initiative called the M2M program. So for those of you who may be here in Atlanta, you may remember the M2M program. So I was at Columbia High School, which was predominantly African American. And I remember in my elementary school, our counselor, our 7th grade teacher, because then it went up to 7th grade, was coaching us of whether or not we were going to do the M2M, where we go Black to white, or whether we were going to stay in our community program. And so I decided, and my parents decided, that I would go to Columbia High School. But what was really interesting is they set up an MTM program, a magnet program to bring white children into our school. And so my mother and other parents kind of got together and protested and said, well, why can't our children be a part of the magnet program? And the magnet program, they had smaller class sizes, everything that we know are best practices with children, right? They also were able to take AP classes a year earlier, which meant savings, right, for college, because now they have 2 years of college exemption instead of 1 year, as to where us resident students could only take AP classes as juniors. And so my parents, they, protested. We want our children, said, no, you cannot be a part of the magnet program. And so that was one effort, right, for the district to begin to think about equity. But of course, it wasn't equitable for the children because we didn't have a choice, right, of our academic experiences. And so fast forward to the Olympics, pre-Olympics. So in preparation for the Olympics, Georgia, particularly in Atlanta, tore down all of the housing projects in Atlanta. All right, and so a part of those Atlanta projects were about 5 miles from our home called East Lake Meadows, all right? And so they completely disseminated the community, the children, the families, etc. And so in that place, if we fast forward 40 years later, there is an amazing charter school called Drew Charter School that is the top in the state and actually a national leader and doing everything that we talk about with cultural relevancy, with having master teachers that are trained to teach in a culturally and linguistic manner, have academic excellence as the standard. So all the benchmarks are what we know is best. However, what we're seeing is gentrification that's taking over Drew Charter School. What we're seeing is that many of our families are recognizing the excellence, and so they're moving into the area, and that area also is changing, and so now the demographics is changing tremendously. And so now the challenge is how do you preserve great excellence that's intended for a very specific population to remain for that population and not to be pushed out. And so now we have another model called the purpose-built schools. If you don't know about that model, I really encourage you to consider learning about that model, which is building upon the same Drew Charter School model. They're again going to, I think, it's Slater Elementary, Carver High, and I think Pierce Middle School. So it's a cluster of middle schools, and they're building on the same type of format, and again, by all foundational funds. So most of it is outside funders that what I'm deeming as racial reconciliation, because they've torn down all of the communities and the housing and the area, and they're saying, oh my gosh, we have some racial reconciliation that we need to do for these children and families. And so that is one example of ways in which, from a historical perspective, we have communities that are led by not only grassroots organizations in the community, but also by families as well. So when we think about this topic as we continue forward our questioning, let's really think about what choices our children, particularly Black, Brown, and Indigenous children, particularly Black and Latino, because that's the primary population here in Georgia, have as it relates to their educational experiences.
So thanks, Dr. Durden. That was a tour de force of all things Atlanta and how this plays out. That was very interesting, given your own history. It's interesting because one of the things that you just pointed out was something that Dr. Watson and Angela mentioned before, which is we've had a history of choice in this country. Choice has looked very different. You can choose to homeschool. You can choose to move, right? Where are you going to buy a home, right? But I think historically we've seen choice being available to some parts of the population and not always to all parts of the population. And advocates of school choice would say we want to open up choice to more students. Angela, given the stats you were talking about before in Georgia and in other states, where at the end of the day, 5%, 6%, 7% of students might be attending in any given state a public school using private school vouchers or savings accounts or some other kinds of public dollars. Why does this topic get so much attention, right? Because I think if you went out and asked the sort of average person on the street what percentage of students in any given state were attending charters or were attending public schools with private vouchers, they might say 20, 25, 35, 40%. They would drastically overestimate how many parents and families this actually affects, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's lower. It's 1 to 2% is the national average currently. Now, this year there have been multiple states pass universal education savings accounts, which means that over time, within most of the states are doing like a 3-year rollout where eventually all students in the state would have access to these public funds that they could then take and use in another school. So the bill that was put forward in Georgia was, I think, $6,500. Originally, it was pitched as a universal ESA, so all students would have qualified. That got passed through the Senate, and then it went to the House, and they negotiated down to the bottom quartile of students, and that really that killed the bill for a variety of reasons. But people don't understand the numbers are so low. Part of the reason folks get so upset, I think, is it's become very politicized. People are also concerned about separation of church and state, so these monies could go to support Christian or in Catholic schools. And so people are concerned about that as well. And they also, one of the rebuttals is that it's just the camel's nose under the tent, right? It's only the beginning. And I can see that point, but at the same time, we have examples in both Florida and Arizona where we've had choice like this for a long time. Still, even in Florida, we're at 4.5% of all students. Again, that's less than are being homeschooled, and you very rarely hear about homeschooling in any of these discussions. So, I work in education policy, and for us, it's important when we're setting policy to base policies on facts, and currently we are not basing policies on facts, we're basing them on emotions and various other things. But it is important to consider exactly what we're talking about, and I think if people knew the percentages and what we're actually talking about, it kind of helps to moderate the emotion a little bit, and people are like, oh, okay, that's not quite so bad as I thought. I live in Arkansas, I work remotely, and so in Arkansas we just passed a universal ESA. And I was on Twitter with, in some of these conversations, and people were really concerned that 60% of the students were going to leave. And I'm you need to look at some of these other examples. It's not 60%. We're, 1 to 2% of students over time are going to leave schools. We also know that in Florida, there are a couple very good studies by leading researchers that show that when these 1 to 2% of students leave public schools where they are unhappy for whatever reason, they're being failed, they don't fit in, they're being bullied, there are all kinds of reasons that people leave. When these 1 to 2% of students leave, they do better in the school that they go to. The school that they left, also the students there also do better because students that are not a good fit have moved out, and the students that are there are happier, or the culture is better. Whatever the circumstance is, it changes the dynamic, and both sets of students do better. So there is evidence to that when these just few students leave, that it can change the dynamic for everyone.
Thank you. So Kimani, one of the arguments advocates would make for school choice is that parents know their children, parents know what their children need. You work with students who have learning disabilities. You work with students for whom English is not the first language, right, as a dual language specialist. As you think about, given your experience working in, as you mentioned, both public and in charter schools, and thinking about what charter schools can add to opportunities for parents with children who have learning disabilities, as an example. What are you seeing as the opportunity there for parents to send their kids to charter schools, and what advice would you have for parents who are thinking about choice as an option for their neurodiverse student?
Definitely. So I think whenever I'm thinking about students that are coming in, if it's their first time receiving an IEP or a 504, like you said, the parent knows them best. And the first thing we always say is, you are your student's or your child's biggest advocate. and to make sure that their teachers are advocating and sticking to that IEP, that legal document, as much as possible, because that case manager, that educational team lead has written that document for that child with accommodations in mind. When it comes to charter schools, sometimes it's easier for the student to be in co-taught sometimes because the classes are smaller, sometimes because it's a smaller group of students. And the nice thing sometimes also is they'll have that option to have small group as well. So at my school, I always tell my kids, I love small group. I think that's where the magic happens. So if you have the option to put your child in small group, if they qualify for small group, try to go down every avenue if you can, and see where they really fit, and make sure that they, if you can, make sure that they actually redesign all the structures of the classes, because we're really seeing now that every student is benefiting from special education, not just students that have disabilities, but students that are neurotypical. So students that that aren't part of our scholar support team actually come to our classes all the time and are asking, oh, can I have class with you? Can I have class with you? I'm like, technically no, but you can come in and bring your work. I'll set a timer. You can have your frequent breaks. Here's a diagram. Here's like, a graphic organizer. So we're really seeing that things that help our students, our students with special needs, helps everyone in the long run, and charter schools can definitely give that for those parents.
Thanks, Kimani. So Kimani just shared a little bit about what I think charter schools can offer parents who are looking for diverse opportunities for their learners. Josh, as you think about charter schools is sort of one standard deviation, if you will, from a traditional public school. Independent schools are further down the line. When you are talking to parents, maybe families and friends who are talking to you about choice and what it might mean for their children, what do you think that independent schools can offer in terms of choice and bringing more appropriate learning environments and more diverse learning environments to children and parents? What is it that independent schools can do? And maybe a little bit about what are some things that at the end of the day greater choice might not add for those same parents and students?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. So I think whenever you think about choice within independent schools, I think the first place your mind goes is that we are not encumbered by state and federal regulation. Now that can be viewed as positive. It can also be used in a negative way, as we saw in the 60s and 70s. But as you look forward, it can be used in a positive capacity, in the sense that the truth is that we are tuition driven, right? And if we don't have students enrolled in our seats, we can't pay teachers, we can't operate as an institution. And so we have to be highly attuned to where the market is and what parents are seeking and what parents are seeking from us. And I think that's particularly acute today as we think about technology and how technology is moving into the education space. That was actually at Arizona State ASU GSV conference a couple of weeks ago, and the innovation and the dollars that are going into ed tech tools. It's unbelievable how much is being spent and focused on that. And independent schools in some ways may be on the front end of that, because to Kimani's point, we're not navigating unions in our implementation of these things. We're not navigating. I think right now there's talk about how you regulate ChatGPT. We're actually getting ready in the fall to launch our own version of I don't know if you guys have seen the Economigo TED Talk. We have our own version that we're already ready to launch in our school in the fall. And part of that, I think, is because we have the ability to really get on the forefront of what our parents who are paying us money want us to do, and try to implement that in a way that meets their specific needs. There's this interesting, going back to your point, there's this interesting conversation right now in school choice. You guys may not be aware of this, but there's legislation in Oklahoma around Catholic charter schools, and whether that can be funded within the state of Oklahoma. And what's fascinating about it, there's actually a great TED Talk. Dr. Ashley Berner, who's also at Hopkins, she's one of the leading researchers in educational pluralism. And I'm going to get the countries wrong, but you'll get the gist. She references that in the United States, we are one of 3 or 4, and you may know the countries off the top of your head, but there are 3 or 4 countries in the world that do not support educational pluralism. And what that means is that the state funds faith-based schools, it funds, in her example, she likes to say it funds socialist schools, it funds a whole variety of schools. And what's fascinating about it is there are 3 countries in the world that, or 4, that don't do educational pluralism: the U.S., Cuba, China, and Venezuela. It's not exactly who we want to be included with when we think about education, right? But what's fascinating about it is when you look at this case in Oklahoma, some of the biggest groups against it are actually Christian schools, right? And it's like, wait a minute, why are independent schools fighting back against additional funding? And it's because they're trying to push back against state and federal regulation. It's like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too, right? If you're going to take state money, there's got to be some level of, well, there's an expectation that comes with that, right? And so there's a push and pull that comes with it, and trying to navigate that as we move forward in the school choice movement, I think is important. And part of that is going to be independent schools, recognizing that, we have to give up some of that independence if we're going to become part of that choice movement.
So that's really interesting. A couple things there. One is the sort of willingness to give up independence if you're part of government funding. But the other thing that I heard you talking about there that was really interesting is sort of parents acknowledging that if they're making the choice to send their child to an independent school, that at the end of the day, it's a market-based school, right? That the decisions you're going to be making are based on what you know about learning. I'm not going to say you're going to put aside everything that's good for students and learning, but at the end of the day, tuition's driving the bus.
That's right. Yeah, we are absolutely market driven. To your point, it's up to us in the same way Steve Jobs told us, hey, you need an iPad. We had no idea we needed an iPad. It's up to us to communicate to our parents and bring them along in what is best in terms of teaching and learning and why your students need this. We were, in 2009, GAC, we were, I want to get my language right, we went one-to-one MacBook, 6 through 12 in 2009. We were at the time, according to Apple, we were the largest school in the country to go that path, right? And it was because we felt like that's where the world was going, and we were going to need to use these tools. First of all, if we're preparing students for what comes next, and they're going to be using laptops when they go to work, are we really preparing them for what comes next if we don't give them a laptop in 6th grade, right? It has to be controlled, it has to be managed. The same way it goes with ChatGPT, right? Guess what? It's not going away. It's not going away. We have to, same way with online learning, right? I looked at a study, sorry, Dean. I looked at a study that came out yesterday. The Castle Group has been tracking office occupancy. Office occupancy right now continues to stay below 50% of pre-COVID levels. At our school, when we went into COVID, we said from that day forward, our students would have the opportunity to go hybrid any day of the week from this day forward, right? And we told our teachers that didn't want us to do this. We said, listen, it's up to you to create an environment that your students want to come to, right? It's up to you to create that environment. And so everybody thought, oh, once COVID's over, only 50% of students will come to school. Guess what? On an average day, we have 90 to 95% of students on campus. The 5 to 10% who aren't coming, it's not the same ones every day. It's students that aren't feeling well and they don't want to fight 85 traffic, or they had a late game the night before, they got in at 11 p.m., and it's best that they stay home today. We don't want them on the roads after they got 4 or 5 hours of sleep. And so it's this idea of being able to press forward in ways that if you're encumbered by certain things, you couldn't do. So I went off a tangent, forgive me.
It's all right. So Tonia, as you think about preparing teachers at Georgia State, other teacher education programs for this wild west of choice, even though we're talking about a small number of students, as Angela was pointing out to us, what do you think teacher training programs need to do differently to prepare candidates to think about teaching in a wider variety of schools, some of which are going to be funded by public dollars, public dollars, going to private schools, independent schools. Do you think there are differences in the ways we need to prepare students, not just in terms of pedagogy and substantive knowledge, but of their understanding of the K-12 education system?
That's a good question. And so I left my really cushy tenured position in Nebraska to come here to Georgia State to run the Birth to Five program. And one of the reasons I did so is because Georgia State is a minority serving institute. And so we are the leading university in the country for graduating the most African American students, besides, of course, your HBCUs. And so I came back to Georgia State because 90% of our students are Black or Latinx, particularly Black women. And so what I found was really an interesting challenge that I had on my hands. So I had a challenge. I was excited to come back because we speak the same language, right? So I am a firm believer in centering the voices, experiences of who you're teaching, right? So I speak African American vernacular. So we're going to speak African American vernacular because that's our home language. And I found it really interesting that I had to first remind the teachers that they were Black and that they were Latinx, and that it is a value, and that is their superpower, and that unfortunately they're in a system that is Eurocentric, and there are a system that composes of policies, practices, and experiences that don't value Black and brown people, right? So I had to first start there. And once I reminded them of their ancestral excellence and their gifts and their talents and their brilliance, then it was like this big awakening, like, oh, I can be myself and I can, soar. Yes, you can be yourself. Yes, you can soar. Yes, you can bring joy to the children that you teach and the spaces in which you teach them. And so that was the first step. So I think when we think about teacher education, we have to first focus on who are these teachers going to be teaching. If they're going to be teaching Black and brown children, then they need to learn, understand the mechanism from which Black and brown children explore and demonstrate their various ways of learning. They're not going to find that in a teacher ed curriculum. They're not going to find that in the Georgia performance standards. They're not going to find that in the assessments. They're not going to find that also in the early learning guidelines, because those mechanisms teach white children very well. They were designed for white middle-class children. So they teach them it's very well. We educate white middle-class children very well. We do very poorly with centering the experiences of Black and brown children. So we have to start first there to identify for teachers, what does mathematical knowledge look like for a 3-year-old, for a 4-year-old, and for a 12th grader within the context of how they're learning math and multiple literacies in their home, in their community, right? So that's number one. It's helping them to really see through the lens and understand the lens of Black and brown students. Also, one of the experiences that I have our students do, because they're teaching in either private schools because they are in early childhood, so they're teaching in private early learning centers already. Or I also have them, we have some amazing African-centered schools here in Atlanta, and so have them visit as well as talk to the directors and the leaders to understand what the cultural component of culturally relevant teaching looks like, right? And to really understand how you bring forth children's ways of being and their culture and their language into the classroom, to see it, to experience it, and to also bring forth your own cultural and linguistic tools as well. And so that's another thing. We are at an assault, right? So our teacher education is currently at an assault where we can't talk about certain things, or we're not supposed to. Diversity and equity has been taken out of our performance standards. And so what we're doing now is just shifting to help our teachers understand that they have choice, that they can go to your charter schools, that they can advocate for themselves if they choose to go to a public school, or if they choose to even go to a private school that has a very linear version of how to be responsive to young children, and say, what are your policies, your procedures, and your stance on this? We have a teacher shortage in Georgia. And so if it doesn't align with your soul and your spirit and do no harm to children, because we're doing a lot of harm to children, then you can can walk away. And so we're telling our teachers, walk away and find those, whether it's a charter school, a public school, an independent school, an African center school. We have so many choices and so many openings. I get them all the time. The purpose-built schools that I was just mentioning, I just met with the young lady who's coordinating it. Help, we need teachers from Georgia State. I'll pass this information along. However, you need to be ready, because they are trained with an equity-centered manner, and they're trained to do no harm. And currently our Georgia schools are doing harm to our children, racial violence to our children, disproportionate number of Black and brown children in special education, disproportionate low number in gifted and advanced. So our teachers will not go to schools that have scripted curriculum, because they've been trained to teach towards cultural and academic, not just academic, cultural and academic excellence. And so I think that's the shift that we're seeing, is that our teachers are becoming more advocates and taking ownership and responsibility for cultivating a generation of excellence. And we cannot do that in our current system that exists.
That's really interesting, Tonia. I hadn't thought about, you really turned this on its ear. I hadn't thought about school choice as being choice for teachers, right? Thinking about what choices teachers can make for themselves. It's really interesting. And I think in the very polarizing debate, sort of the unions are pictured on one side and choices on the other. And if you think about advocates for teachers saying this gives you greater opportunities, it becomes very powerful.
There have been talks in the choice community about legislation for teacher choice and providing state funds for teacher PD, where they would have an account and they could use that money for choosing like their own advanced education options, their own PD, those types of things, and trying to better empower teachers to make some choices of their own as well. Yeah. So they get a taste of the choice.
Yeah, that'd be very interesting, particularly given the teacher shortage that we see around the country. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to think about for just a second a closing remark that of less than 30 seconds around what would they like to see, what information would they like to see in the debates around choice that they do not see. And I think I'm going to ask you that in just a second, but I think what you saw tonight was an empirically based discussion from different viewpoints, different perspectives, different experiences around school choice. And when I typically turn on the TV or happen to see a politician or a union representative or someone else talking about choice in this country, it's not as informative as this. It's usually one perspective only, and I'm going to drive that perspective home, and it's either choice is a good thing or choice is a bad thing. And I think the really hard to understand thing about choice is it's neither good nor bad. It's a variable that impacts students and schools and parents and their learning, and it's part of who we've been as an educational system in this country for our history. It's becoming even more important, but even so, as Angela's pointing out, it's not quite as dominant or ubiquitous as we think it is. So I'm going to get to the panelists in just a second, but before I do, we're coming up on our time here, and I want to thank our host, Tiffany Ingram, who was so gracious and generous with her time. Thank you, Tiffany. Tiffany's sitting right up here. Did you meet everybody already, Tiffany? Okay, so Tiffany's standing right up here. And Tiffany told me this week, or actually last week, when she and I were talking about this event, she said, this is SEED. This is the SEED event. So I'm hoping that we'll see each of you at the next event with 3 or 4 friends, relatives in tow. And that our next event, which might be this fall, which might be next spring, we're going to look at some dates here, where we're going to be talking about another important topic in K-12 education. And Tiffany, for those of you who don't know, is a member of our National Advisory Council at the School of Education. She's a 2019 graduate of the School of Education. She is the Chief of Staff of the American Diabetes Association here in town, and she is a fellow at the Bloomberg School at Hopkins. So she's got all sorts of Hopkins ties. So, again, thank you for attending. I'm going to go from right to left here. I'm going to go from right to right here. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists for 30 seconds. What do you wish in the that you heard in the debates around school choice that typically isn't part of those debates?
Yeah, so I think I referenced this earlier, but I think I would combine 2 comments. First, I want people to hear what Dr. Watson had to say as it relates to, first of all, what is the reality of the context? And if you do go down this path, what does it then mean for where you're headed. But I also think that Dr. Berner's comments on educational pluralism are critical, because those get left behind. But the truth is that the rest of the world has figured out how to do this, has figured out how to do school choice in a way that's meaningful for students, that gives families choice, but is not polarizing and antagonistic. There is a way to do this. Now, I'll preach to my own self in independent schools. That means we got to give something up. But there is a way to do this. And so I think that learning from others and understanding the reality of the context, as well as how other countries have done this, would be helpful.
Thanks, Josh. Angela?
So I won't go into the facts again, but I do think it's an important consideration to make sure that folks understand the facts, and getting that message out there, I think, would help people come to the discussion a little bit more rationally instead of so emotionally. But at the end of the day, I got a choice for where my kids went to school. My kids attend public schools. And as middle-class family, what we do is we buy a house in a good school district, and that's exactly what my family did. And we had the means to be able to do that, and I don't think it's fair that only people that have money have choices, and that's currently where we're at. And so I think an honest acknowledgement of that, and oftentimes you will hear opponents of school choice say, yes, but I paid for that. Well, what about people that can't pay for that? Do they not get a choice? And so, I think that an honest acknowledgement of the facts and an honest acknowledgement of who has choice currently, because lots and lots of people do.
Thank you. Kimani?
I honestly agree with you, Dr. Watson. And honestly, I would like to see Black, Brown, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, and disabled children centered in the conversation, and low-income students centered in the conversation, because they are never centered in the conversation. And let's be honest, they are the ones that are always rezoned first, and they are always the ones that get the last pick, and they are always the ones that historically get the littlest, bittiest pieces of everything that's left in education, and it's horrible. And I just want us to actually reckon with what we have done historically in American education to all of those subgroups, and also to the LGBTQ plus community as well, students, because they are suffering as well.
Thank you, Kimani. And Dr. Durden, you get the final word.
Yes. Yes. So.
Is this dangerous?
Bringing it back, right, to Baba Asa. I know an hour and a half left. Do we have the will? So we have to ask ourselves constantly, do we have the will to educate all children? And if we have the will, then the question is not whether we should have school of choice or not. The question should be what school choice. So we need to look at the 1% and whether or not those who have school choice, whether the children are just surviving or really thriving, okay? Because we haven't answered that question, whether or not the school choice is really beneficial for children. And then for that 99% that really wanted to get in an awesome, amazing African-centered charter school, but have a 500, student waiting list, what about those children, right? And so we have 100 years of models, of educational approaches, but we have to ask ourselves, do we have the will?
All right, thank you again for braving the rain, and it was great to hear from the panelists tonight. I certainly learned a lot, and we'll see you next time we're in Atlanta.